I brought Melanie on because, and hope to have her here more, because we're going to talk about how trauma from our heritage, the pioneer heritage, and specifically some very dominant personalities in our Latter-day Saint heritage and culture have bled into the DNA and psyche of the Mormon people. In particular, Joseph F. Smith. Well, you guys joining me today, sitting on a pillow and a box so we can be the same kind of height as Melanie. And I say same, but you're still shorter than me here, so. Melanie's mom taught her early on that dynamite comes in small packages.
Correct.
So Melanie packs a lot of dynamite, and I brought her on today because she, for the last 15 years or more, she's worked with a clientele to help people with trauma. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Melanie's my wife, by the way. Did I mention that?
Not yet.
Oh yeah, we've been married for 25 years.
Yeah, almost.
It's been glorious.
December, right? Glorious.
Melanie bought me this shirt at Costco. I'm really loving it. I've had it on for a total of half an hour, and most of my good clothes, the best clothes I got, come out of Costco.
Thank you, Costco.
Then I've got them travel pants. I got the utility pants I can wear swimming and hiking and to church and all that.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to have you here, Mel. Tell a little bit about what you do.
So I use a few different modalities. I use one called EFT or tapping. I use one called integrated processing technique, and they are geared all around trauma, recovery, emotional release.
Yeah. I try to get as many people in front of Melanie as possible because I think it's just one of the most effective modalities out there. It's really, really amazing, especially for teenagers. It's for anybody, but anyone. But I like to get teenagers because I can't imagine having the tools that she has when I was a teen. But
the earlier the better.
Earlier the better. So before you get set in your ways. But I brought Melanie on because, and hope to have her here more, because we're going to talk about how trauma from our heritage, the pioneer heritage, and specifically some very dominant personalities in our Latter-day Saint heritage and culture have bled into the DNA and psyche of the Mormon people. In particular, Joseph F. Smith. And I think there's some real dominant figures in our past whose voices were so intense and loud in good ways and also harmful ways that have bled into the culture and made it a little bit, and I don't even think we realize that it's part of our DNA, but that it probably began and was initiated in trauma.
Absolutely.
And Melanie, as always, we're always having this conversation. She talks with people all the time about generational trauma. Tell them about that book that you're always recommending. I think is such a awesome book. I listened to it and thought it was great.
It's called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Woolen, and he is a therapist that specializes in generational patterns. And so generational patterns are things that our mom and dad did and their mom and dad did, and it gets passed down. And so we have our own experiences different than theirs, but we kind of interpret them to mean similar things. And so they're just, some of it's coming through DNA, some of it's coming through modeling, but we end up interpreting them in a similar way to mean similar things.
Yeah. And we've all heard that story about like the grandma who, or, you know, there's a kid who's like cutting their ham, or not the kid, but like the mom who's cutting the ham. She's like, and the kid says, "Why do you cut your ham on both ends?" And she's like, "I don't know. That's the way grandma used to do it." And come to find out, she asks grandma and finds out that the ham just wouldn't fit in the oven back in the day. So we are operating and doing things on a daily basis in our relationships, in our parenting, in our day-to-day life culture that I believe embeds and stems from some deep trauma that happened in our pioneer past. And I think understanding it and understanding the lives of some of these people can help give a little compassion, but also help us understand maybe some of these things we don't need to hold on to any longer.
Yes.
Right? And some of them we do. Some of them are really good qualities. And Melanie's really good at sitting back and like seeing that something can be good and bad at the same time.
Good qualities, but need more balance or a different come from.
That's beautiful, babe. So here's three things. I'm gonna be a little bit top heavy and talk a little bit about Joseph F. Smith because I've been diving deep into his biography right now. It's been out for a little bit. It's called Like a Fiery Meteor.
Is it new?
I think it's pretty
book?
new, yeah, by Stephen Taysom. He's I think a professor out. I don't want to say where he's at, but he is an excellent historian. Like, I'm so impressed with this book. It's very balanced. It's very good, and it's actually helped me to understand, like, oh my gosh, that's where that originates. This one thing that we do in our culture, and it doesn't necessarily come from something Jesus taught or an actual gospel element. It just comes more from an intense tribal element because of some trauma that we experienced back in couple hundred years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just run these past Melanie real quick. And start with this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is in the back of my mind. I love this quote because it kind of helps us understand that things are a little different today than they were when the church first started. And Ralph Waldo Emerson says, "An institution is but the lengthened shadow of one man." And I'm going to say that we've had different phases in the church, and say that I actually think it's the shadow of multiple men. And women too, but largely some intense experiences with some leaders in the church, specifically Joseph F. Smith, and Brigham Young. Today we're going to be focusing on Joseph F. Smith, and we're going to go over these topics. Mel, tell me if you see these in your... Melanie meets with a lot of people on a weekly basis to go over these things, and I thought, I want to see if she sees some of these things in our culture. And I want to talk about the pros and cons, because there's always both sides of this. Defensiveness and a victim worldview.
100%.
Have you seen that in people?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, that's something we grew up with, very much like the world's out to get us a little bit, like it's us versus them. It's us sometimes versus science. It's us sometimes versus a spouse. We have to be right on certain things. Like we have a deep flinch in our culture, and
we've been wronged.
And we're continually being wronged, mistreated. Patrick Mason talks about this in his book Restoration, where he says we have had the fist clenched, and we've been a fortress church, and how there's a need for us that we don't need that fortress anymore. That's that theme.
And this is also, I see that very thing when we're young and when we're developing our beliefs and how we see the world. For a time, they're good for us, and they protect us, and they help us survive the situation. However, when we grow up and we're not in that same situation, we're in a totally different situation, that program is still running when we don't need it.
That's wise words, Melanie. I'm going to say it right now. Like, I think that that's so important to have compassion, because the other thing I see happening in our society, in our culture, is one side saying, oh my gosh, these people wronged us, and the other side saying, oh my gosh, these guys blessed us. And the truth is that we got both ends of the stick. We got so many blessings out of this trauma, and we also got so many curses out of it. So let's flush that out a little bit and see where that stems. The other one I want to talk about is loyalty and duality. The us versus them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so human.
I mean, let's just say in terms of, Melanie, I can say this, like, we have different ideas on faith sometimes, and we had a period of where we're like, I want to go this way, and I want to go this way spiritually, and you go, now it becomes like this, I'm right, you're wrong type thing, and there's this dualistic thing, is it has to be one way or the other.
Right. And both sides end up defending their side and trying to make the other person wrong. Yeah.
And that can be really hard, especially when you're in a mixed faith family or mixed faith marriage, or you have a child who leaves the church. This loyalty thing here, in the life of Joseph F. Smith in particular, and Brigham Young, becomes like because of some of the experiences they have, they start seeing people as who dissent or don't have the same beliefs within or leave the church as worse than the devil.
For sure.
I mean, we can also, we grew up with that, just like this intense, like an apostate is worse than a non-believer who didn't grow up Mormon or.
Yeah. Some of the people who grew up in our day heard the whole rhetoric of it would be better had a person pass away than like leave the church, right?
I think Melanie brings up a beautiful point here, because that's almost word for word what Joseph F. Smith said about we'll get into it, he lost a lot of children, and he at least comforted himself by saying, at least I'd rather have this happen to them than have them deny the faith.
Yeah.
And so they escaped that terrible fate of denying the faith, right?
Yeah, and just for like a little bit more clarity, this whole it roots this us versus them. It roots in very like black and white thinking, right? So someone has to be right and someone has to be wrong, when really this isn't the truth. And it's, again, that stuff that at one point maybe was helpful for us, but at a later point it doesn't have to be that anymore, right? Like it's actually more complex, and we can both be right and we can both be wrong, and it can work. And
sometimes still useful, like loyalty is such a great virtue. All of these things are virtues, by the way. I mean, maybe not all of them, but I think
loyalty is definitely a virtue.
Super intense virtue, incredible virtue.
Until it becomes like a division.
Yeah, and when loyalty becomes, when you are blinded by loyalty and you can't see that there's a real problem in your tribe, and you're not willing to speak out to it, that's when it becomes a problematic. And another one is, let's see, poverty as a virtue.
Yes, I see this one
scarcity mentality.
I'm a better person if I have less or if I give everything.
Yeah.
Both financially, but also energetically. If I'm just constantly giving myself endlessly, but it leaves us in emotional poverty or energetic poverty. Yeah.
So we're going to go through, and then we're going to end with compassion, because I think Joseph F. Smith had a deep sense of compassion. And I think it was because of the circumstances and the experiences that he had in his life. And I think that's a good, just a nice, well-rounded way to end up this discussion. So let's go right into this. I want to talk about some experiences and give an overview of Joseph F. Smith. So bear with me just for a minute as I give a little description here. Joseph F. Smith is the son of Hiram Smith, and I think it's extremely important to understand more about his life, and because we start to kind of pick apart and understand the origin of a lot of these things. He was very, very influential, but in the beginning of his life, he was the son of Mary Fielding and Hiram Smith, the brother of Joseph Smith. So he grows up his first 6 to 9 years, I think 6, 7 years in Nauvoo. And they're just fraught with problems. And imagine you're like a little kid. He's like a toddler. He's like 1 or 2 or 3, and a mob comes in, ransacks your home, trying to rob their home, and he's laying on a mattress as a little baby, and the mob like is throwing things everywhere. They throw a mattress on top of him, like almost suffocating him. It's a miracle that he even lived out of that. But these are the kind of things that are happening day to day, like in Nauvoo. He's watching his dad and his uncle and his family be constantly persecuted, and that leads to the death of his father. So his last memory in Nauvoo is as a 6-year-old of seeing his father like on the ground with his face mutilated, with a bullet in his face, and his mother walk up just screaming and can barely even walk, and kissing the face of her husband. She can't believe it's real. She's just saying, is this real? Are you really gone? And this is a little kid watching his parents have this experience and his dad die. Leaves a scar on his life that will never, ever leave him till the day he dies. And And I think we can have a little compassion and go, okay, we can understand where this leads. And then there's the famous stories of him as in like a 9-year-old, like going across the plains with a group of pioneers, and he's like driving a wagon team of horses across, and so
like on his own, right? Like he was with the group, but he was in charge of his team.
Pretty much, yeah. It's pretty remarkable. They get to Salt Lake. They're in extreme poverty. His mother, Mary Fielding, is very stoic individual. She doesn't put up with crap. She didn't put up with crap when Hiram was alive. When she inherited 6 kids because Hiram's wife, Jerusha, had died. And she's like, I don't really like raising these freaking kids. Like, I like being married to you and I love you, but these kids are driving me freaking crazy. And she stood up for herself. And that intensity, this intense fieriness in her personality bled down into Joseph F. Smith. And there's a bunch of experiences of people trying to take advantage of her and her just not putting up with crap at all. And Joseph F. Smith develops a deep, deep defensiveness towards his mother. Like a bond that he never really overcomes, because they get to Salt Lake and they're extremely poor. And you imagine, like, there's one tree in Salt Lake when they arrive, and then there's hardly any shacks. There's like shacks and people living in tents and all this stuff. They don't have anybody taking care of. They got like kids, all this crap. It's just hard. And they're there for like 4 or 5 years, just grueling through these terrible conditions. But his mom doesn't even want to be in the inside circle with all the people, because you would think that they'd be a little bit more compassionate towards her as the wife of Hiram Smith, but they're really not. Like, nobody's really helping her out. And this really actually makes Joseph F. Smith even more intensely fiery in his soul. And he is wrestling with a lot of rage and anger, like that he never leaves him till the day he dies. Like, imagine there's nobody like Melanie or a therapist or somebody there to help a kid push through this pain and trauma and process it. Like
experiences.
Yeah. So when he's 13, 14, I don't remember, somewhere along his mom ends up dying. She's like 51 years old. It just absolutely crushes him. Like, he's already crushed, but now he's like raging with anger a little bit. I don't know at what point this happens, but he's like 14 years old. His little sister is in school, and she is like, the school teacher mistreats her somehow. And Joseph F. Smith takes this as like an affront, because remember, he has now got this mindset of everybody, we're the underdogs. Everybody's out to get me, because he watched that everybody truly was out to get him for this whole entire first part of his life. And so he's so upset at the school teacher that he goes and literally just beats the tar out of this teacher. Brigham Young finds out about it. Heber C. Kimball, who kind of took him under his wing, and they're like, we got to do something with this kid. So they sent him on a mission at age 14 to Hawaii for 4 years. And this is like 1840s, 50, like early 50s, something like that. Anyway, this is where we're at this point. Are you following me, Mel? Is this boring? I hope this isn't too boring.
No, all along the way I can go, I'm hearing these things that are related to generational patterns, like just the fact that his mom was very stoic and very like, not a lot, like when you say people aren't helping her, it might be because she's putting out this energy of, I've got this, I don't need anybody. But
you're right,
I would almost guarantee that one of her parents had that attitude too. And so it's generationally, and then we can see it passed on to him as well.
Yeah.
Like,
and you're right, her dad did.
the
and she did.
fieriness that you're talking about.
She literally set herself outside of the community in the countryside because just as a like, I'm going to take care of myself attitude that bled into his soul. I mean, deep into his soul. And so you're right on the money. So going back, he's on a mission, 4 years of, if you think there's poverty like in Salt Lake City, he goes to Hawaii, and it is like another planet of poverty. And the intensity that he experiences inside of inside of that place, he talks about his brother being soft, who grew up in Salt Lake City.
Oh.
Right? His half-brother John, who was one of Hiram's kids as well, who, by the way, ends up becoming the patriarch in like his 20s or something, like 30s or something like that. So anyway, that's a whole nother story. But he has this capacity to be able to just push through things. 4 years, he comes home.
Because his mom did, right?
Yep. And
learned it somewhere.
And because of this deep bloodline of being the son of Hiram Smith, and also feeling that intensity and that also pressure of living up to his father's whatever.
Right. And not that another person wouldn't push through, but it's the way they push through.
Yeah.
It was what was modeled. It's what's been passed down and taught.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting. He comes home from his mission. And by the way, this is like walking across to San Francisco, going across boats. It takes months just to get to a mission at this time. And the first thing he sees when he comes home is an invasion from the army. So, which just leads to, here we go again.
Reaffirms that belief that someone is always out to get us.
Yep.
Yeah.
And ironically, during this period, you have to keep, the Republican Party is built, is initiated on the two promises to get rid of the two twin barbarisms in America of slavery and polygamy. The irony, the irony there. But anyway, that's just a whole thing. So within a little bit of time, he gets married, and his wife has some deep, potentially maybe bipolar or some deep depression issues, and but they're not even together for very long. He literally gets called on a mission when he's 20 again to England for 3 years. So by the time he's 23 or something like that, he's been in 7 years of missions. Mm-hmm. And while he's there, he has such intensity, feelings towards a lot of the children. And he doesn't have as much compassion towards adults as he does, but the children just bleed him, make him just his heart, he's an orphan. So he's he literally brings a 4-year-old orphan home with him, adopts him, and they raise him as their own.
So if I'm hearing this from the perspective of generational patterning, he is identifying with these other children as orphans. And so that can go one of two ways for him. He held compassion for them. Sometimes in generational patterning, it can go the other way, where we're really hard on those orphans, and not because we don't love them or hold compassion for them, but it's because we know their life is going to be hard. We have to be hard on them so that they can get stronger and survive. It's all survival. He's coming from the side of, I'm going to help them survive by holding space and helping them. Yeah. Sometimes we do it another way.
Yeah, that's great. Well put. And you also, when he comes home, there's a deep sense of loyalty. So now you're having this invading army come. Sorry, this is Hawaii, but there's still. I want to go back to that little excursion with the federal government, the federal army coming in, trying to take over. It just cements this idea that the whole world is out to get us. The United States at this time, when we left winter quarters in Nauvoo, the whole rhetoric is we're no longer part of this dragon, this terrible institution that God is going to bring down and destroy, and that the kingdom of God will overtake that entire government. That's the rhetoric that's going on during this time period. And polygamy becomes an institution in 1852 during this time period. And so you have just somebody who has the perfect personality or the upbringing to become a very black and white thinker.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of friends, I know people who grew up with very traumatized childhoods who become extreme black and white thinkers. Mm-hmm. And that is definitely Joseph F. Smith. For the better or the worse, there's so many good things that come out of this black and white thinking. And at the same time, we're talking about, there's also these this shadow that is still, I think, plagues our people to a certain degree. So let's go into this again. Now, poverty is a virtue. Joseph F. Smith experiences extreme poverty since the day he's born. He goes on missions, and he literally is having to rely on the help of the Latter-day Saint people to pool money together to keep him on a mission. While he's gone, he's not providing for his wife and his children. His first wife, they don't have any children. His wife's not able to have kids. But this is a story over and over in his life where he thinks that money is going to ruin or something. That Brigham Young thinks entirely different. Brigham's got a whole different idea about money here. But they're very nationalistic in terms of like we help our own, we don't help outsiders, and it's born out of the idea they literally had such scarce resources that they were like, oh, we have to only take care of our people, and that is going to be like literally Brigham Young for a time period starts excommunicating people if you're helping or selling goods to outside of the federal government or outside Gentiles, so to speak. And it's potentially something that was necessary at that time.
Sure. But
he literally comes to the point where he said he starts to turn poverty into a virtue.
Who turned poverty into a virtue?
Joseph F. Smith.
Yeah. In what way?
In the way that he's saying that...
how did he do it?
Yeah, if you're focused on riches in the world and all that sort of thing, then you're going to lose your testimony. All this sort of thing, even though Brigham Young, by the time he died, amassed, was the first millionaire in Utah. He has to rely on people for a long period of time and watch his family suffer. And rather than just say poverty is the worst thing on the planet, the response that we see a lot of people, they try to make sense out of it. And the making sense out of the poverty is just making it a virtue.
Yeah. And helping us, so when we do that, when we turn into a virtue, it's helping us work through the situation that we're in, right? It's like helpful, it's useful in the moment. But then we talk about it, like I would say this one is still at play in our culture, where money is the root of all evil, right?
Yeah.
And if you have money, you're going to become corrupted. The only way to be acceptable by God is to give it all away, to not have it, to be poor, to, that kind of stuff. And so I definitely see that in my clients. And the interesting thing about that with like Joseph F. Smith is, he did survive on nothing a lot. And when you're in the mindset, that's the only thing you see. When you have this belief system, the only thing you see is, I have to work so freaking hard to get through. I'm on my own, and this is what God wants. And we don't see the abundance around us. And so I'm sure he did recognize that people were contributing to his mission fund and probably helping out his wife, but sometimes we block that out and we don't see, we can't see the other stuff. Yeah.
And interestingly enough, he becomes one of the people who is to disentangle Brigham Young's estate after Brigham Young dies, and he's astounded at how much money and they're like, there's this, I'm going to give a little compassion to Brigham Young here and just say that the government can come in and freeze assets if it's under the church's name. So Brigham Young shoved a lot of it under Brigham Young's name. And it took him a year and a half to disentangle with lawyers all the money between Brigham Young. But at the same time, he's going, these kids of Brigham Young are expecting this inheritance, and they find $700,000 of that time that is under the name of Brigham Young that they give back to the church, and the kids are like, what about our money, kind of thing. And it actually really shakes up Joseph F. Smith a little bit, where he's going, geez, this guy was I'm living paid like off of other people's money, and this guy's like a millionaire. And it really and understandably was very disturbing for him, and maybe to us too. So there's some things we're going to talk about Brigham Young another day. That's a whole nother topic.
Yeah. So then this belief about money and how it's bad, yet at the same time we want it, and then we think we're bad, and we end up resenting it. Ends up affecting us. It ends up affecting our relationships because we resent the people who have it. Like maybe he was like, what does this mean about Brigham Young? And, but it ends up really hurting our relationship. And And we end up living, we don't create what we really want in life because of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's embedded into his psyche. And keep in mind, he never had a father that he watched, like, he never had a father that he watched actually work a normal job or as a farmer or anything like that. So he's like literally just kind of scrapping and figuring this crap out on his own. His mom's not there to give him any guidance. So the men in his life actually become the Brigham Young, George Buchanan, and they become the mentors for him in some ways. So,
but so what you're saying, he didn't grow up with a father to show him how to do it, but he did grow up with a mom, and the way she did it was by, you have to work so hard. So what you look at is the underlying belief about, like, life is hard, you have to work really hard, money's bad, and then that you end up creating that.
Yeah.
And
yeah. And it's okay, we're just gonna, rather than ask for help, we're gonna be over here away from the group of people.
We have to do it, we're on our own.
Yep, it's better for us just to be over here and not ask and not expect any, she didn't have any entitlement and did not like the fact that she wanted any attention. She didn't want any attention because she was Hiram Smith's wife. She's like, we're doing this freaking on our own. And that stoicism is so commendable and amazing, and also has a downside to it.
Yeah, which is like, it's awesome that she had no entitlement and that she did do this really hard thing. And on the other side of it, maybe it would have been okay to maybe accept help, and maybe life could have been a little bit more easier, and we could have had better relationships or a community that we belong to more.
Yeah, and I think Joseph F. Smith's a little guilt for having to take charity to go on these missions and stuff, but and it's interesting to note that Brigham Young also, he's probably the first case in which somebody's like, you know what, we're going to straighten this kid out by sending him on a mission. And he doesn't have the best of experiences, but later on he ends up loving the people. So that's a side note. We're going to move into the loyalty and duality. This one is still something that is so deeply entrenched in our community that is actually, I think, so necessary for a tribe or an individual to put up boundaries and say, this is who I am. And so there's a plus and a minus to this. In the Latter-day Saint tradition, I believe that we're still a very young institution. We're still a very young religion. When you have a group of people who was ostracized and treated like, we created some of our own problems in the very beginning because we grew so fast and scared a lot of communities in Jackson County and these places where, like, we double the size of their population and we expect there not to be any backlash. So, that's a whole nother story. But because we were kicked out of these places and we felt this intensity, we're like still trying to establish who we are as a people. The same way like a teenager goes out and rebels a little bit and like goes, I don't know who I am, so I'm going to go test this and test this. That's the way I'm going to just have a little compassion and try to personify this as what this church was going through at this time period. When we go out into the desert, we are setting up, this is who we are. Unfortunately, we set it up in the worst way possible, which is we use polygamy as the defining characteristic that defined our people. And I see that as being so, no mistake about it, that distinguished us from the rest of Christianity and the rest of America in a way that galvanized their people strangely, and at the same time created this problem we still have to deal with today, which is this crap thing we call polygamy. And you're talking to two people who don't really think this is a God instituted thing. I look at it as more as a time period where a teenager goes out and has to smoke some cigarettes behind the barn and be like, okay, I tried that and we done that. We don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
What do you think of that, Mel? Is that dumb?
Nope.
Okay.
But I would say also, along with polygamy defined us, I would say our victimization also defined us.
Oh, huge.
Right? We are the people of God. We've been pushed out. We've been wronged and victimized. And in order to compensate, we make the other people bad and wrong. And we have to we do this overinflation of us and who we are. And
Yeah. We started out, interestingly enough, Joseph Smith started out very much like, go and take truth from no matter what tribe. Take it from here, take it from there. We let Methodist preachers preach at the pulpit. All this stuff. And then when all these bad things happen to us, we move to the desert. We go into like isolation mode. We put up some heavy walls between us and the government and outsiders. We can't stand Gentiles. Like, there's a lot of rhetoric about us that distinguish between the RLDS church, and there's all this bad talk going against Emma and all the people who stayed in Nauvoo as a way to define a tribe. And Joseph Smith is in the middle of this, and he is drinking the Kool-Aid deep, and he's going, yes, this is us, and we're God's people, and anybody else outside of that is crap. Especially the RLDS, the people who stayed, who remained and did not have the faith enough to follow us into the wilderness are the devil's spawn, and
they've betrayed us. They betrayed
us.
The faith, yeah.
So let's dissect this a little bit and give a little compassion to this imagery. Joseph F. Smith's father and his uncle are killed by dissenters. They're killed by people who were once part of our people. I mean, to a degree, like the people who are creating the Nauvoo Expositor, and they're doing this stuff. Joseph F. Smith sees people who leave as people who have the potential to kill a loved one.
Yeah.
So this is like a deeply traumatic thing that becomes embedded into his psyche, that you're in, you're good, you're out, you are not just bad, you are of the devil.
Enemy.
An enemy. And that, I think that's so important to talk about today in our context, because we can see this happen. We have people come over to our house. Mel has clients all the time going through faith struggles, and their parents are looking at them not as like just somebody who's on a journey that they're trying to find their own faith and their own spirituality, but they're finding somebody who is like maybe potentially going to ruin their entire existence or something.
Well, when you're the one in the family who's maybe doubting or leaving the church, we've made them out to be the enemy historically.
Yeah.
And so then you don't know if you still belong. You don't know if you'll be accepted, if your children will be accepted. You could be shunned. You could be you could be the cause of the breakdown of the whole family system.
And we can't blame this all on Joseph F. Smith, because this is just built into our DNA as humans. Yeah. We are very tribal people. We see we survive in tribes. We thrive in tribes. And I think a tribe is really, really important. And I think this was an important time period for our people. But you'll see that over time, the pendulum starts to swing. And ironically, I think the government is actually the thing that ends up saving us in a way by freezing our assets. And I think isolation, we realize, is not the best thing for us. We realize,
or any group.
Some of the ideas we came up with while we were in isolation in the desert, we're still grappling with today, and still dealing with the ramifications of polygamy, the Adam God theory, racism, all this stuff that
What was that one? The atonement one?
Blood atonement. These are ideas when you're just kind of out sniffing your own farts, and you're not like, somebody told me in California, I know there's this big few California Mormons hate Utah Mormons and whatever. Somebody told me, they said, Mormons are like manure. If you put them all together, they really stink really bad. But if you spread them out, they're beautiful. They fertilize everything in such a beautiful way. I'm not, and that's not canonized.
This is true in some ways. And in some ways, there's some really beautiful things about our concentrated group of people too.
Thank you, Melanie. Yes. That was just something.
But it's also true.
Yeah.
There's some truth to it.
Yeah.
There's some not great things that happen in isolation. Yes, 100%. But can I say one thing about the loyalty? Because the other thing that I see a lot in people is that when the loyalty becomes the prime, number one important thing, is loyalty actually ends up being our form of love. And it's kind of not the real, authentic form of love. It's like If you love me, you will be loyal and belong and do what the prescribed way is, do the social agreements. And so loyalty becomes the form of love. And then we're not really connecting on an authentic level. We don't get to be ourselves. The pro is that it builds a really great community, but the con is we lose ourselves in the whole of it.
And to some degree, loyalty becomes an idol.
Yeah.
Like I'm loyal, that becomes a badge. And no matter, I could be a complete terrible human being. Like I just found out I have an ancestor that was massacred. He was one of the assassins in the Mountain Meadows massacre. And, but you know what? He was loyal, and he was, it's like, okay, that's cool. But like, you know, so what we see happening during this, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Another big thing, a problem with this loyalty thing that I see is it kind of can totally wreck your relationship with God, because you end up believing that this is what God wants from me. He wants just my loyalty. And he doesn't really care about my authenticity or how I really feel. The most important thing is my loyalty, my obedience, the letter of the law, the dogmas, rather than like being happy or being myself.
Yeah, I mean, we are hitting on something that is such a struggle for people today. Like this friction between me and the group, like, and it's just a real balance. And I personally believe both of those are extremely important. But in the early days of the church, that tribal intensity really is what helped us to thrive. Like it really helped to build numbers. It really helped to build communities. And within 10 years, there's 70,000 people in Salt Lake City.
Structure, safety,
industry. Put your own individual will and desire aside. In fact, you know what?
For the greater good of the whole,
it's a very Romanesque ideal. Like if you want to talk about how the Roman Empire thrived for 1,000 years, it's because to be a Roman statesman was far more important to be an individual. And you know, Mel and I, we take groups to Italy, and we talk about this a lot, like this friction between us and, you know, our own personality and the tribal personality. And in those initial stages, the people who thrived, that went to the top, like and still the same way, like loyalty is still how people rise up in hierarchy in the church. Intense loyalty is still deeply embedded and is so
probably the number one
freaking important. But it causes some intense collateral damage when somebody who's going, I just am not fitting into this tribe. This is actually hurtful for me. We see that a lot in our community today. And a lot of parents who are going, you know, it's more important that I pay allegiance to the church than I even listen to what my kids are saying about the pain they're feeling right now. You can see how this virtue can be turned into something that can actually be damaging to a family and a relationship. I think that there's a way to be loyal and to also be loyal to your children, and there's ways of doing this that's not so black and white. And that's why we're having these conversations. But
finding the balance and realizing, yes, loyalty is good, and yes, so is individualization, knowing myself, being authentic to me, and sometimes you do have to choose, but it doesn't have to mean the end of the relationship or the community.
Yeah. And I'm going to just step back a little bit and also say that keep in mind, just imagine you're 6 years old or 6 to 9 years old, and your entire family, your cousins, are now fractioned off. They're fractured into groups. There's like his cousins now are part of the RLDS group. His uncles are part, and aunts are still part of his grandmother is still a part of the RLDS group. Like some of the deepest connections he had as a child are now. It's now an us versus them proposition of them. They're in, we're out, they're whatever.
We're now enemies. Our family is now enemies.
Deeply traumatic for a child to see. And he could not understand why somebody would not, why these loved ones of his would betray the faith from what he saw. It's just something he could never understand till the day he died. Okay. Is that enough on loyalty and duality? Like, we could just see everywhere, like still today, you go to the pulpit, you go to church and somebody's saying, so-and-so, you know, they left the church, they'll never be happy. There's still all this rhetoric and this language in our culture. Even if, like, we have a good close friend who was like, who no longer felt like a really strong ties to the Mormon faith, but was like deeply connected to Jesus and like secretly reading the Bible in their home. They don't want their family to know I'm reading the New Testament and I'm studying about Jesus, because that loyalty, it's
not in the form that I'm supposed to be.
Yes. And so even though I'm studying about Jesus, like, it's not a part of this group, and therefore it's crap, you know. Okay. We end up as a people swinging the pendulum back towards the United States. And that same thing is happening today, where I think so many people have swung the pendulum into, like, away from the group and gone, you know what, I was not allowed to find my own individuality, and so therefore I need and I think that's such an important thing for people to find their own individuality. And at the same time, I think some people you see start swinging back, not necessarily into the church, but into another tribe or something, because they realize that a community is really important. Well, what I see
most is they swing the pendulum from the church is the best and the only way to the church is the worst and the only way, like non-church is the only way, right?
Yeah, there you go. That's a much better explanation.
You're on the same line of thinking, you're just on the other end of the pendulum. So people think they've totally made this big switch, but they're really still in very much black and white thinking. And what really, like, ideally, and it's like so fine to go there and be there for a bit, because it's part of coming out and deconstructing and unwinding that line of thinking. But hopefully we can go back to, maybe there's some okay things here, and I did learn some of this over here, but I also like this, and hopefully that pendulum can swing a little bit less and less until we find a middle ground, right?
You put that beautifully, because that is certainly the experience. We live in a polarized country, and part of the reason why I created this paradox for a discussion as paradox is to show that these things are far more complex, and far more interesting when you can, rather than say, oh, this is all this one way or all this one way or all this way, then that's really not helpful. I think, go ahead.
And we really... This is happening, it's happening in the, people who are in the church or leaving the church, but it's also happening in our government, it's happening politically, and it's happening in the feminist movement. And so we swing the pendulum, and ironically, if you know about shadow work or that kind of thing, we become the very thing we hate, right? We become the oppressor, thinking that we are the liberator, but we are really just oppressing just the same as they had oppressed over here. Or we hate just like they hated, and we become the very thing that we are preaching against. And the hope is that we can really just open our mind to that there's lots of ways, and we can all love each other in all the ways.
Beautiful, babe. Let's kind of shift gears a little bit here. We'll start kind of winding down here a little bit, because I actually think this is really fascinating, because Joseph F. Smith in particular is like the perfect paradox. Like, he is, I shouldn't say the perfect paradox.
Everybody's the perfect paradox.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. But he just happens to have these, has very distinct
and seeable.
Yeah, and he struggles and cannot stand the rage that he feels inside of him. And he was said to have been somebody who would just lash out. Like, he got a divorce from his first wife, and he was a little bit verbally abusive. He was immature. He was young when he got married. And I'm not trying to make any excuses here, because he physically, she claimed that he beat him, he beat her with a rope, and he literally, when he was an apostle, lost his temper so deeply at a neighbor that he beat him almost to within, he internally bled. This is real stuff that happened, and he hated that rage inside of him. He prayed to have it gone. He's the one, the book's called Like a Fiery Meteor, because he describes himself like a fiery meteor. All this pain and intensity of watching his people die, and all this stuff is coming and welling up in him and not knowing really what to do with it. And I'm giving a little compassion here. He ends up having 6 wives at a certain point, so you can, go and think about that whatever you want. But
can I put this in there while we're on that? Like he witnessed a lot of violence as a child, and then violence comes out because he did not have the opportunity he didn't know how to process violence, how to make it into its proper meaning, and so it ends up, and this is how it happens for all of us humans. We experience something, if we don't know how to process it, if we don't know how to turn it into wisdom, it ends up manifesting and coming out often as the same thing as it came in.
And you don't have any tools back then of dealing. You just stuff it down. And his mentors are people who are still avenging the death of Joseph Smith. Like the rhetoric is about revenge to the day he dies. I think he's like in his 90s or something. I don't know how old he is, but he literally, maybe he's in the 80s. Anyway, he never forgives the people who killed his father. He never forgives the people who took that away from him. And he basically says the best I can do is like just not harm them or something like. So he has some intense stuff. After his first marriage and his first divorce, I'll just tell this one real quick. When he gets married, he ends up being much more compassionate to his wives and especially his children. And so we'll get into that a little bit. And I think he has some pretty deep shame about that first marriage, but that's a whole other story.
I was just going to make the point that he has all this rage and violence coming out, and at the same time, he has so much love and softness toward children and holding that space. And so it's like this polarization of both, which is really the truth about all of us. We all are capable of all the things, and it's really just dependent on our childhood experience and how we process it, how it ends up manifesting. And
he's deeply worried through his whole life that he's not coming off as strong enough as a man. And he says this at the pulpit one time. He would just be broken down to tears when he was speaking, because I'll tell you why in a second, but he says, although some think that I'm a stoic, I'm but a child. And he's saying this because he's ashamed that he keeps crying at the pulpit. But if you can understand what happens to him in this, well, I'll just tell you, this is how I want to wrap this up, is compassion, okay? This is where I see this really good part of him that's really interesting. He gives everything he has to this people. He literally gives everything he has. And over the course, up until the year before he dies, he's losing children right and left. I mean, he ends up in his lifetime losing 13 children, which is just, while I was reading this book, I literally just was broken to tears because of some of the intensity that he's describing coming home and not hearing the pitter-patter of steps of losing children. And he describes losing every single child as he describes losing his mother and losing his father as paling in comparison to losing every single one of his children. It gives him such a deep compassion for little kids that he can't not just weep about the whole thing on a regular basis. And when he's on his mission, he goes on 4 missions, literally not wanting to go back to England. He goes back again while he's married, and all he can write back to his wives is please. He remembers, and he's reading all sorts of stuff about children dying, and he has extreme anxiety. Imagine you can't write each other, and the letters are coming months apart from each other, and he doesn't know what's going on with his children. He's writing instructions saying, please don't leave a tub filled where a kid can fall in it. But he's begging them, and he's on a mission, but all he can think about for the most part while he's in England on that 3rd mission is just one of his kids dying. It's so excruciating to read the intensity that he feels it, and his wives are having to deal with this extreme stuff that's going on. And a lot of these kids are 1 and 2 years old. Like I can't even imagine. It just is terrible. And this helps him develop a really, really deep compassion. And also he has like this deep intensity. So you have this compassion and this rage working side by side. He says literally that anybody that would say anything bad about his mother, he's like, if I would have had a weapon on the spot, I would have killed that person. Like that's how intense he's feeling. And ironically, sometimes these are the kind of personalities that end up being the kind of people that build institutions.
But you can see based on his experience, his childhood experience, he suffered as a child and he does not want any children to suffer. He's trying to protect the children. As a child, he watched his mom suffer a ton of grief, but also just hardship. Yeah. And he doesn't want, he never wants his mom to suffer, right? And so he's protecting her. But what this, like, I didn't read this book, but when you read it and you started telling me about it, the things that I had heard about him previously was just, he's so black and white, he's a hardliner, all this, but hearing his story really humanized him, and I can see exactly why he has done all of that. And the intention is not, in being a hardliner, the intention is not to hold the truth back. It's not to hurt people. His intention was really to protect his people. It comes out of trauma and pain and ends up hurting people long term. But in a way, it solidified the community, the foundation of the tribe, I guess.
So well put. And I want to wrap this up simply by saying, how does this lead to us? I mean, we've already talked about some points, but Joseph F. Smith becomes literally the person who's supposed to gather the information and become, to a certain degree, a historian of gathering information and stories and all this stuff. There's a whole another episode we could do about him discovering that there's really no contemporary evidence about polygamy, like that Joseph Smith never practiced. I shouldn't say this, but there's no contemporary evidence during Nauvoo time. And he's really confused that he can't find any evidence that polygamy was actually a thing in the Nauvoo period. There's a whole episode of historical things. He's put in charge of gathering all these affidavits and the historical records and interviewing people. But he's doing it from the context of us versus them. He's doing it from, he's not a trained, he's been to school for like 3 days in his life. And he ends up having a child with his second wife, who becomes Joseph Fielding Smith, who Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie, I believe in the last 100 years, influenced the church so dramatically and deeply into the culture and DNA of our people that it was just, you can see this generational thing going from Joseph F. Smith to Joseph Fielding Smith. Joseph Fielding Smith becomes the church historian for 50 years. And a lot of people are really mad at him right now. There's a lot of stuff, especially on the people who have left the church, talking about Joseph Fielding Smith betrayed us. And the truth of the matter is he curated the history. There's no doubt about it. Like he gathered for 50 years documents and things from all over the place. He wrote a history. It was very flowery. It didn't but we're trying to give a little context to why there's this deep sense that he's learned from his father that if you give any fodder or any bad thing to the outsiders, they will take this and ruin our lives. Mm-hmm. So he's doing it not from a place of we don't know all the motivations, but I'm just trying to give a little compassion here to the idea that we've been betrayed with hidden information or something like that. In my early days, in the 90s, 80s, 90s, history was just thought about entirely different. Like loyalty had much more to do. We learned the story about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, only the flowery stuff in American history. It's really only been the last 20 years where we're starting to dig in, not in just church, but in America and all this stuff. We're digging into the warts and things. Mm-hmm. And
this is true of all cultures as well. All cultures have a story that they've told, and you can't tell all the parts, and definitely cut some parts out. It's the same thing we do with ourselves, Everybody wants to put their best foot forward, want to be seen in a certain way.
Yeah. And Joseph Fielding Smith wrote some books that were technically not really supposed to be written according to the voting of the Quorum of the 12. Bruce R. McConkie writes Mormon Doctrine. He's the son-in-law of Joseph Fielding Smith, and they're all cut from the same cloth. Very black and white, very, very intense, very us versus them. Joseph Fielding Smith wants nothing to do with the RLDS Church. Like, you can see this bleeding through into our grandparents and our parents, and because they're all reading all of this stuff coming out, and it doesn't have anything to do with the compassion, maybe, of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that Jesus is saying, forgive 70 times 7 or whatever. It's like they're blinded to that because culturally there's been so much trauma and pain. Is that a good place to end, Melanie? Like, I think we could do an entire separate thing on Joseph Fielding Smith, Bruce R. McConkie, but for now, we're just talking about the paradox of Joseph F. Smith. I'm not even done reading the book, by the way. I still am got a little bit left, but I just want to, I think that polarity happens when we dehumanize people. Yeah. Like, I'm tired of polarity. I'm so sick and tired of being one side, member, non-member, Democrat, Republican. Like, it's so much more complicated. Like, nobody is, like, even inside of a family, like, you have two people who believe in the church who are believing two entirely different things oftentimes. Like, so.
And to bring that down to like a micro level, it's honestly what we do with ourselves. There are parts of us that we hate and parts of us that we like. And we try to hide these parts, and we try to project them onto others. And if we could come to this greater love of all the parts of ourselves and acceptance for all of our good and our bad and all the things, all of our trauma, we could then project less judgment and hate into the world. And I think that it would happen on a larger scale. We would have less polarization and dehumanization. I
think it's healing. I think you're spot on. I think that as we have integrity about a situation and we don't pretend something's all good or all bad, and we take the word integrity, root word is integer, it means whole. Like, as we see the whole thing coming together, that Joseph F. Smith was both full of rage and full of compassion. And
when we can see that his rage is there as a protection mechanism, not just because he hates and and the same with us. I'm angry because I feel this, I feel threatened, I feel whatever. And it's really information for us to look a little bit deeper rather than judging that in us and shutting it down or projecting it. If we can just look a little bit deeper and understand that these things are not bad parts of us, they're information.
It becomes helpful. We learn from these people. So anyway, Melanie, what a beautiful appearance that you've made today.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. Love you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Good job. Okay.